Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021, live from virtual broadcast Alley. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this segment is a good friend, Alla Valente. She is an analyst at the Security and Risk Group within Forrester Research. Alla, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Matt, thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
You and I have similar backgrounds when it comes to third-party risk management. You and I have done a few events and interviews together, and I love this topic because I spent a lot of time doing third-party risk management for one of the large national banks when I first went into the compliance space. And we're going to talk about some of the updates, maybe trends, improvements in third-party risk. We're also going to talk a little bit about supply chain risk, obviously top of mind at this conference and for a lot of people over the last few months after SolarWinds and some of the other events that have happened. Let's start with first third-party risk management and what are we seeing from a trend perspective there? And then I want to double click down into things like supply chain, open source, SBOMs, because I think they belong in a third-party risk program. I'm just not sure where we are with those yet.
No, all really great questions. So, goodness, what are the trends? I mean, what we're seeing the trends to be are that third parties are continuing to be the attack vector for a lot of, hackers and organizations who do a lot of great work in securing their own enterprise unless they're focusing the same level of effort and resources at managing the risk of third parties. They're really leaving themselves exposed to, unintended consequences. So I wish I could tell you that organizations are getting really good at third party risk. I think what I can safely say is it's a topic that comes up very frequently. In fact, just this morning, I had 4 inquiry calls. 3 of them were about third-party risk management.
And so do we still see third-party risk being driven by the procurement teams with inputs from finance and legal and security? Are they really still the driver because they're in the seat from a procurement perspective and getting them into the system? Or are they still pretty distributed around the different organizations?
Yeah. I mean, there isn't any degree of consistency across organizations. In fact, third-party risk is almost like a hot potato because everyone touches it and yet no one really owns it. When you think about compliance risk, I mean, you have, head of compliance, legal risk, finance, there are designated owners. When it comes to third-party relationships, they really touch a lot of different areas. They start with sourcing, then you have procurement, then they might get thrown over the fence for information security, maybe then back over to procurement to work out the legal, maybe finance, there's some sort of business owner. And then once we get that third party contracted and onboarded, then it kind of goes silent for a while until it's time to maybe relook at that. And that becomes problematic because it's that lull and it's that lack of ownership that really exposes some of the risks in third party relationships.
Yeah, and so I remember at the bank, our high risk vendors, we'd go out, we'd do the risk assessment, we'd do the control validation, we'd come up with the remediation tasks, we'd track those to closure, and the next year we would do it again. But when we think about how fast things are moving from third party components, annual is not enough. And we only did that for high risk, Alla. We didn't do, for mediums, we were doing it like every couple years. And if you're low risk, we'd look at you like every 3 years. I mean, that frequency doesn't work anymore with the way we're using other third-party components in our programs, right?
You're absolutely right. If you were looking at the categories of risk, you are already a step ahead because many organizations look at third parties from a criticality perspective. How critical are they to my business? And some of the metrics that they use to determine criticality is things like spend. Well, we spend a lot of money with them. Therefore, they're critical. Therefore, this is where we need to concentrate our efforts. And that's not necessarily the case. There are third parties that might be single source. So there's only one, third party, whether it's vendor or supplier for this given product or service. And so you kind of have to work with them. There are small and mid-sized businesses, especially in the supply chain. A lot of those companies are small and privately owned. And if they are either touching your data or you're exchanging data, or perhaps they have access into your network, maybe into, they have access into financial information or even IP, intellectual property, they should be treated as a high risk and should be getting a much more thorough level of evaluation. But where the real problem is that too often organizations will select a vendor, they will sign the contract, it gets sent over for some sort of assessment, a thorough due diligence, so now we can onboard them. The problem is if those risks are not identified before the contract phase, then you really can't build in, extra controls or create opportunities for you to be able to mitigate that risk and have the power of the contracting process to do it. So, for example, if we were evaluating these third parties before we went into contract, maybe during some sort of RFP process or slightly after that, we can say, okay, well, we have these 3 vendors, we really want to work with this one, but there might be some issues that they need to fix. Well, great. Then you can put that into the contract.
Right.
You can say, we'd like for you to fix this in 6 months, and then in 9 months, we want to see something else. And then in a year, this is what these things need to look like. And you have the power of the contract to be able to hold them accountable.
Yeah. And that was always the challenge at the bank, right? Was trying to get ahead of it, because a lot of these contracts are already signed. We're trying to put requirements on them after the contract's signed. Guess what, guys? They already have a legal contract with the bank. There's only so much I can do unless you're willing to replace them with somebody else that's going to meet your requirements. So getting ahead of this is the challenge. And then back to my frequency question, staying on top of it is the next big challenge, because stuff is changing so fast now.
It really is. And that's why we see that you need more than just, let's say, an annual assessment. There are a number of technologies that do, third-party risk intelligence tools that are real-time. Maybe it's a financial rating of this vendor. Maybe it's some sort of cybersecurity incident. Maybe they had some sort of data breach or some business continuity issue. What we're starting to see is that, okay, you do that assessment, but then you also lock in these other technologies to be able to monitor continuously. You set your parameters because, of course, you don't want to be flooded with a bunch of alerts that don't add value. Mm-hmm. So maybe you say, my threshold is X. If this score changes, within this level, then I want to be notified. And then the next step is, okay, you're continuously monitoring, but what do you do with that? Mm-hmm. Because unless that monitoring is also followed up with some sort of action, some sort of, whether it's risk mitigation, some sort of response, maybe there is some sort of workflow or even a full reassessment that needs to happen, that's really what the best practice is. Monitor continuously, but be prepared that if they exceed your thresholds, that you will take some sort of action and know what that action is.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Let's talk about some of the additional challenges on top of just the normal third-party risk, the way we think about it, which is my direct relationship. Let's go fourth, fifth, sixth-party risk, because I think this is a really interesting challenge for organizations. I outsource to company X. Company X outsources to company Y, who outsources to company Z. And what you're going to see is this concentration around some very big providers that may not have a direct relationship, but guess what? They're creating potential risk through these transient relationships. I can name a few around the cloud providers, right? A lot of people are running on Amazon or Microsoft Azure or Google, and they may not be assessed at a direct third-party relationship. They might be, but they're also engaged in providing other back-end services for some of these other providers. How do organizations think about fourth, fifth, sixth party risk?
That's a really great question. right now, I would say only about a third of organizations are actively assessing fourth parties. And even then, those are fourth parties that they deem to be critical to their critical third parties. That said, many more organizations are starting to map what this sub-tier looks like. So even understanding, okay, I work with this company, they work with these three companies, those three companies work with what have you. Because this is what ends up happening, again, just too often is that, okay, you might have backup providers for specific services, right? Like, this is not a single source. I've diversified. I have a plan B. That's great. Except if all of your third parties are working with the same fourth party, and that fourth party has some sort of event, maybe it's a data breach, maybe it's natural disaster, weather related, something else that takes them offline. Well, guess what? Your third parties, it doesn't matter how many of them you have, they're still going to be impacted. So what I would say about this fourth, fifth, nth party is, at the very least, do that mapping. Know who knows who, right? Think of it almost like a personal network. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you look through your LinkedIn, you're like, oh, I didn't know this person knew this person and that person knew that person. It's really the same with your third parties. Understand who they know, who they do business with, and figure out whether or not there are concentrations you should be thinking about, and also continuity strategies you need to put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's some interesting software providers out there. I don't want to get into names per se, but I know there are some folks that are really mapping those relationships, and I think those solutions have some value to understand those relationship connections, because again, you're going to get concentration somewhere downstream that becomes a higher risk than you think it is, because so many providers are using a single service for something or other. So, I think that's an important part. The other thing is, let's talk about open source. Let's talk about software bill of materials. Let's talk about that. We had an interview, I think it was Monday night on Application Security Weekly. We were talking about some of these aspects and from two perspectives. One, marketing teams are using a lot of third-party components on the website. Google Analytics, HubSpot Forms, all these things that get integrated into your website.
All of the attribution technology to figure out who's touching their website and what they're doing. Yep.
Exactly. And I know for a fact, when I was at the bank, we weren't thinking about those as third parties. We weren't. They were not on the radar screen. And so that creates a very interesting risk component when you think about your third-party relationships, is all these other like little plugin things that are running on our website that we're not even thinking about could be exfiltrating customer data, location data, all kinds of stuff, right? Is anybody making progress on including them into the third-party risk management program?
What an excellent question. Are people making progress? Yes, there are some people that are making progress, and those are the organizations that are saying, look, the way we define third party is antiquated, and we need to change that. We need to update what a third party relationship is, because Matt, it's not just those marketing technology plugins, right? We also have other types of relationships. So like, think of brand agencies or even PR firms if we're outsourcing PR. Think about services providers that we have that are not IT services. Maybe they're audit services or financial services. Then also think about things like the gig economy, right? We have a lot of contingent workforce. We think about contingent workforce as, oh yeah, that's that retail location during the holidays, for some an extra pair of hands. Well, that's not what the gig economy looks like today. In fact, there are a number of firms that outsource some really critical operations. Maybe they could be building technology at your organization. Maybe they could be working in a capacity where they are touching, either it's your network or your data or other proprietary information. If you are not considering those consultants, those gig workers as third parties, you're really leaving yourself open. But then I also want to get into sort of this like non-human third parties. Look, one of the things that we saw, after the pandemic or sort of during the pandemic is that today it's, go digital or die. Having just physical retail locations doesn't cut it. You need to meet customers where they are, and you need to provide, an experience that matches their needs. But what that means is that a lot of organizations that were like, yeah, we know there's this digital transformation. We know that we have to change some things, but we're not ready yet. Well, guess what? The pandemic kind of pushed them over the edge. And so, maybe by 12 to 24 months. And a lot of that transformation involves things like algorithms, AI, open source technologies that help you build certain products in-house. And if you didn't build it, you don't own it, and you're not maintaining it, well, it's a third party. So what happens when the algorithm that you're using gives you a false positive, or worse yet, some sort of biased result that then you're accountable for, right? Mm-hmm. Unless organizations are thinking about open source technology as a third party, those algorithms as third parties, I think they're really limiting their scope of third-party risk management, and it's just going to come back to bite them.
I go back to the OCC's statement back in 2003. That's how long I've been doing this stuff. You can outsource the function, but you can't outsource the risk.
Outsource the risk.
And the function here happens to be open source. And when we look at the breakdown of applications, 95% of these modern applications are running some component of open source. But yet no one's looking at the open source components as a third-party component. And I think that's a very big risk that hasn't been addressed and definitely not incorporated into this third-party risk management discussion. So my question to you is, will things like the software bill of materials become a component of third-party risk to try to get your arms around all these different open source components, or are we nowhere close?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's definitely on the radar. I think the information from the software bill of materials does need to be part of the broader third-party risk management, data set, information that you're monitoring. I know that, the GRC technologies and third-party risk management technologies, they can take that information and help you identify if there are vulnerabilities, which products do they reside in, whether or not they've been patched, what the status is. But ultimately, software bill of materials is going to have to become part of the third-party risk management conversations. There's a lot of technology that's getting built. It's getting built in-house, but using these third-party components, and we can't, like you said, you can't outsource that risk. So while the brand's reputation is at risk, they're going to have to take ownership of it. And the other aspect, I think, of understanding exactly where you've used that technology is just the speed of response. We know in an emergency, time is everything. And if you're recreating your process or your playbook each time because you're still trying to figure out, okay, what did we use that open source? Where did we use it? Which product, what do we need to do next? You're really behind the eight ball. Having a list of where it resides, what it's being used for, and what needs to be done, and having that at your fingertips is really going to be the difference between, a news story that said this happened and everything's okay versus, being dragged out in the media as kind of a warning, right?
Yeah.
I mean, nobody wants to be, that next one.
Right. And it ties into the resiliency story that also is really hot right now about resilient services. Resilient services means I have to understand who all my other players are in the stack, because, if I have to recover, I have to restore, I have to keep operations online. I mean, you have to know what you have and what you're using. Otherwise, that resiliency story doesn't work.
Absolutely. And, this is what I'll say about resilience is that when we evaluate third party, vendor, supplier services, what have you, oftentimes there's a question, well, do you have some sort of business continuity plan? Okay, they say yes, they check that box, that's great. But are we asking them, when was it last tested? When was it last updated? What changes were made? Because having a piece of paper that no longer applies to the current situation, isn't really going to get you through a crisis. And that's not what's going to, help keep you resilient.
Yeah, for sure. Alla, great insights. Thank you as always for joining us on Security Weekly.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, we have one more micro interview for today, so stay tuned.